Hey designers, welcome back to the studio. So far this semester we've been doing a lot of work with sort of two-dimensional sheet to form or sort of three-dimensional polygons, real rigid geometric forms. This next unit we're going to be working on are some more complicated forms, something that's got more curve to it, more flow to it. We're going to continue using some of our wood strips, but we're going to use them in a little bit more advanced way, a little bit more deliberately trying to kind of take advantage of some of the qualities of that wood that we didn't necessarily take advantage of our last assignments. We're going to make use of a technique that I learned actually by carefully observing boat makers and actually building boats, or I even used this in building aircraft, the sort of ribs and stringers technique, where we're going to use thin flexible strips of wood and rigid ribs to sort of define our expanding and contracting form. It's going to allow us to kind of pick up some really interesting skills along the way, and also kind of bridge a gap between our ability to render and draw open forms and construct them, fabricate them using wood. We're also able to kind of fabricate out incredibly lightweight, larger forms because of the ribs and stringer technique is so delicate and retains its strength over large amounts of space or large areas. Before we actually start talking about the technique and some of the tools we'll have to make, I want to introduce a couple of artists through some texts that I have. One, first of all, I'll talk about is an artist whose work you've probably already experienced if you've ever been to Chicago in the downtown area. Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate, what everybody likes to call the bean, the large reflective steel sculpture. In this piece, Anish Kapoor designed for Chicago. He makes use of an incredible organic shape. It actually feels sort of like the sort of a droplet of the metal he was thinking of while he designed it, a piece of mercury, right? It feels like it flows. This thing weighs tons and tons and tons. It's all steel girders and stainless steel plates, but it has a sort of lightness and fluidity to it that seems to sort of be almost in strange contradiction to what the materials are made out of. And because of all of those curving surfaces that go inside and outside, it appears to be an entirely unbroken mirror image of the city. A couple of other artists I want to take a look at would be the artist Martin Puryear. Martin Puryear is sort of American sculptor, classically trained carpenter and woodworker, so in that way, right, some of the materials we're going to be working with are going to feel really similar. But I also like Puryear for this example in that he is a printmaker and a drawer, and a lot of his work is sort of has its roots in his drawings. I think this is a really interesting thing to learn as young designers ourselves, especially since we just came out of a drawing unit. Another artist who is using drawing in this way is Talasnik. I was introduced to his work through a sculpture garden in the western United States, and the way that his artworks often began are through these amazingly intricate, sort of fantastic industrial spaces. This one, the Mad Hatter, right, has this feel of something like either industrial girders or roller coaster, but you have the sense that these drawings could be constructed, or that they are loosely referencing sort of an industrial sort of construction method, not unlike our ribs and stringers technique that we'll approach. Now, Talasnik is not just an illustrator or a drawer. Many of his drawings have iterations that also live as sculpture objects, and so I think he's an interesting artist to take a look at because of this sort of transition back and forth between a constructed material object and an illustration or a drawing, right, that lives as its own piece. From here, we'll actually start to talk a little bit more about our materials. Now, some of the materials we're going to need for this project you'll find in your 3D design folder, so we'll start there. The first thing that we're going to kind of pull out are a couple sheets of sandpaper. The sandpaper that we're going to use comes in two varieties. I want you to make sure that you have both of them. We're going to use a 120 grit sandpaper and a 220 grit sandpaper. Now, grits may not make any sense to you at all, but just sort of feel the surface of those two, and I bet you'll immediately know the difference between them. The 120 grit sandpaper has a larger grit, and so it's a coarser, more aggressive cutting sandpaper. The 220 sandpaper has a smaller grit and is a less aggressive, more like a polishing. We're going to need to use both of these, and so we'll actually be kind of tearing these down and making some tools out of them. So keep both of those handy. We've also got a sheet of black foam core. Foam core is just sort of art language speak for what is a laminated building material that is really kind of fun to use. It's essentially a bit of foam that has been pressed on both sides with a sheet of tagboard or paper. In this case, we've got sort of black on black on black, and it's going to allow us to do both cutting and sanding fairly easily. What I kind of like about the foam core, as opposed to maybe working with wood, is that it's going to allow us to work a little bit faster, and it's going to allow us to work with tools that we're already fairly familiar with, like an X-Acto blade. If we were going to jump up to working in woods, even softer woods for this project, we'd have to introduce some other tools and sort of extend the project time a little bit. But if we can do it in foam, we can do it in wood. So keep the sort of interest in woodworking sort of set aside for now, and we'll get this designed out in a little bit easier to work with materials first. Now the other thing, some sort of additive pieces that I'm going to put into your kit, is make sure you've got an extra popsicle stick. We're going to use it for its flat surface, but also its thickness, and you should have a couple of extra rubber bands. You've got one rubber band that came in your kit. It was wrapped around the polyfill, the fluff, and I'm going to give you two more for this project. We're going to use them as clamps that sort of hold our form together while they're gluing. You're going to need at least 3 of these things. You can use whichever ones you want. I'm just going to, have a couple of these in your kit and a few extra to pick up in the classroom. Finally, we got to talk about the wood strips we're going to use. In our previous project, we used our sort of square stock. If we were taking measurements, our square stock is 3/32 by 3/32. Now, you have a few extra pieces in your kit that are actually a little bit flatter, and they're half the distance. They're still 3/32, but if you flip it sideways, it's actually only half that thickness, roughly half that thickness tall, 1/16. Right? So if you look at that, if you look at the cross section of these pieces, they should be squatter. Now, even if the wood that you got is not quite up to those dimensions, what we're mostly trying to look for is a little bit more bend, the ability to bend or flex this wood. We're not going to steam bend this wood, like for example how furniture makers might steam bend their hardwoods to bend. This is not a hardwood. We're not able to steam bend this very easily. It's still a fairly fragile wood. Even if we steam bend, even if we sort of cook it in a steamer and heat it up, it's still going to fracture and fray. But what we're going to do is just sort of take advantage of the flexibility afforded because of the thinness and the cut. The very first thing that we'll do today is actually prepare our sort of cutting and sanding tool. This is going to look a little bit like a nail file or something, but what it is a popsicle stick that has been wrapped in 220 grit sandpaper. And this is going to be really helpful, not just for sort of getting into tight areas to sand, but actually we're going to use it to cut notches into our foam core. Now, because the foam core is such a soft material, instead of using the razor blade, we're going to use a little bit of an abrasive cut. It's going to give us about the perfect width for fitting our wood strips right into those so that our ribs are carefully fit for our stringers. For that, you're going to need this a nice straight popsicle stick, and you're going to need your 220 grit sandpaper. At school, we're probably going to use spray adhesive to mount the sandpaper to the stick, but if you're at home, don't worry about it. We still have that PVA glue left over from the previous project. That will work just fine for this. What you need is a piece of the sandpaper that is wide enough that will sort of cover 2 sides of the popsicle stick. So grab your X-Acto blade and a straight edge. And I recommend cutting from the back of the sandpaper. That way you don't dull up the blade too badly on on the grit on the front. I know that seems crazy, but the grit is actually a harder material than the blades are made out of, so the more the blade comes into contact with that grit, the more aggressively it will dull or even sand down that blade. Now what we need to do is we need to get some glue, some epoxy, some spray adhesive onto the back of the sandpaper, and then roll that sandpaper over and make it fit on 3 sides of our tool, both flats and then one skinny edge. I don't need quite so long of a piece of paper here, so I'll just kind of tear off this little bit. Don't throw away the sandpaper. You always end up needing tiny little bits for this project, so keep those little bits around. And what I'll do is put some glue down on the surface of this sandpaper, and then have something heavy close by so that I can use it as a weight. A book would do just fine for this, or a stack of piece of wood, something like that. Something that's going to be able to keep this thing in compression, so you don't have to sit here and hold it. Once you have that piece of sandpaper coated edge to edge and corner to corner, carefully line up the wood. And what I like to do is use a hard surface to sort of fold that very carefully right over the edge. Do some careful fitting here. Make sure that the sandpaper doesn't have any wrinkles or any crinkles in it. Obviously the back edge is going to be ragged for now, but we'll trim that off at the very end. Once you feel like that sandpaper has a good fit on both sides, lay it on a nice flat surface, put something heavy on it, and come back in a few minutes. That's pretty much all we're going to try to take care of, guys, here for the first day. Tomorrow we'll come back and start talking about actually cutting the ribs, designing the shape of our form and cutting those ribs. I'll catch you in the studio.